This podcast is brought to you by the American Enterprise Institute.
If you like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, review, and share.
Thanks for listening. Here's our show.
What the hell is going on?
What's really going on?
We said, what the hell happened?
You don't have to know what the hell is on it.
They see what's going on. I don't know what's going on. What is going on?
We must find out what is going on.
Hi, I'm Danielle Pletka.
And I'm Mark Thiessen.
Welcome to our podcast. What the hell is going on? It's Labor Day. The new season has begun. Mark, what the hell is going on?
What the hell is going on is it's Labor Day and the Democratic Party has lost labor.
No kidding. And a lot more.
And a lot more. So we're talking about the state of the Democratic Party, and the Democrats are in a world of hurt right now, Danny. So the Wall Street Journal poll, most recent Wall Street Journal poll, 63% of voters have an unfavorable view of the Democratic Party. That is their worst showing since 1990. Only 33% hold a favorable view, so they are underwater by 30 points. They have not had a above 50% approval since the 1990s under Bill Clinton. It's been a steady decline, but now they have really hit the lowest level they have in a while. There's a really fascinating New York Times story, which you pull some of the stats from, but they've lost 2.1 million voters over the last 4 years, while Republicans have gained 2.4 million. So that's a shift of 4.5 million voters to the Republican Party. They are now having this fight over gerrymandering, and they are going to lose it because Republicans have unified control in 23 states and the Democrats have unified control of government, meaning the governorship and both houses of the legislature, or in some cases unicameral legislature, in only 14. And they are seemingly unable to get out of their own way. They keep coming down on the wrong side of 80-20, 90-10 issues. They are, the 87%, New York Times poll, 87% of Americans want to deport all aliens with criminal records. 65% wanted to deport everyone who came in the last 4 years, and they're showing up at ICE facilities and protesting in favor of illegal migration. They're coming out for men and women's sports. They're opposing Donald Trump cleaning up the streets in cities where 80% of people think the crime is a serious issue in major urban areas. On issue after issue after issue, they're just coming out in favor of the position of the progressive elites, and they can't seem to figure out how to get out of the political wilderness.
Well, I think you just explained why they're in the political wilderness, because, in fact, the Democratic Party has become not the party of the 1%, perhaps, but the party of the 20%, right? This is on every single 80-20 issue that I can think of, whether it's the ones you detailed, illegal immigration, crime, we're going to do a podcast on that, all of this, the Democrats are on the wrong side. For me, this was encapsulated in a conversation that we had before we took our book break, which I really loved, by the way. But before we took our book break, which was this conversation that we had about Kilmar Abrego Garcia, apart from the fact that
the Maryland father.
Right, the Maryland father / wife beater / member of alleged gang member. That he was chosen as the sort of poster child of immigration for the Democratic Party, for me, encapsulated everything. There are so many better candidates. There are things that have really gone wrong. There are episodes where ICE has taken people who are absolutely, not here illegally, not supporters of terrorism, but no. Right, I picked my favorite. Right, this Muslim woman from Boston who's a BDS, a boycott, divest, sanctions person, but nothing else. Doesn't support Hamas. Nothing else. Not her, but they had to pick that guy. And this is the encapsulation of everything that's wrong. And I would say that there's another part of something that you and I have talked about a great deal over the years that contributes to it, which is that they only talk to each other. The New York Times reporters only talk to Upper East Side, Upper West Side, Chelsea elites, and they don't know people like us. I can't even think of the last time I got a call from a New York Times reporter. Actually, they don't want to talk to people who disagree with them. They want to talk to their people, and it's reflected in their media. So yeah, no surprise the Democrats are in a world of hurt.
And so here's another structural problem they face, which is so voters in America are not just leaving the Democratic Party, they're leaving blue states, right? There's been a mass outmigration from California, from Wisconsin, from Michigan, from Illinois, and from a lot of these swing states, leaving and going to going to red states. So their incompetent governance in these blue states has led to people voting with their feet and leaving. And what that means is that after the next census, there's going to be a massive shift of both congressional seats and electoral votes away from blue states to red states. And there's an estimate that so you're going to California, New York, Illinois, Minnesota, Oregon, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Wisconsin are projected to lose about 12 seats in Congress. And Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, Texas are all expected to gain seats. And what that means is, Donald Trump won by breaking the Democrats' blue wall. Next time, even if the Democrats hold the blue wall and win all of the states that they win, they still don't win the presidency. The blue wall is been torn down. And so unless they can start fixing this disastrous far left progressive governance, not just in Washington on the national level, but at the state level, at the local level, in cities. You got New York, where Mamdani is headed towards winning election. A Marxist socialist, I would say a communist. People are going to leave New York. If you keep electing these crazy people, more people are going to leave, and that's going to put you in like a permanent minority. At the national level. Mamdani actually hurts the Democrats nationally. Mamdani will make it harder for them to win the presidency back after the next census. So they're in serious structural difficulty.
They are, although again, I would caution that this is something you see in every single cycle, which is that, the party in power thinks about its own structural strength and its opponent's structural weakness, and they end up getting, smashed in the face with a giant pie at election time. And I think Karl Rove would agree with us. We should have Karl Rove back on, by the way. I love Karl. But I think that's we need to be cautious about that. It's not clear to me who is going to be taking the mantle from Donald Trump. But if it's J.D. Vance, I don't think that he's going to win. I know I'm not.
You don't think J.D. Vance beats AOC?
I don't think AOC becomes the candidate for the Democratic
I think she could very
Party.
easily become the candidate.
All right, everybody, write that down, right? Because
I'm not predicting she will be, but she's going to be very competitive. She's going to be very competitive in a Democratic primary today. Yeah, absolutely.
We'll see. We will see. But in any case, we talk about all of this and a lot about really interesting redistricting stuff with our guests. We've had him on before, and he is awesome. We should have him more often. It's our colleague Jay Cost. He is the Gerald R. Ford non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, a fine Washington think tank. He focuses on political theory, Congress, and elections. He's also a visiting scholar at Grove City College and a contributing editor of the Washington Examiner. He is a guru on American elections, and one of the things that I really like is that I shamelessly plagiarized actually from him for a piece that he wrote in July that was outstanding. He really tries to put a lot of these questions in a historical, constitutional founders context, which I think makes it all the more interesting and trenchant.
Here's our interview. Well, Jay, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's great to have you on. So it seems like the Democrats are in a world of hurt since Donald Trump's election. And quite frankly, over the last 4 years with the collapse of the Biden administration and the public repudiation that they suffered in the election. And they can't seem to figure a way out of it. What is going on with the Democratic Party?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that their big problem is the last 4 years of governance. I think that they're bearing the burden for their failures to tame inflation and to just govern in a way that is consistent with the promises they made in 2020. I mean, Joe Biden promised to be normal. He promised a return to normalcy, and he, far from delivering it, he brought chaos and he brought a sense of national calamity, frankly. And that is something that is going to stick to this party for a while. How long it sticks to the party remains to be seen. Sometimes parties have been in the wilderness for a long time, like Jimmy Carter, who I think is the presidency closest to Biden's, is just, I think both of them will be remembered as men who were just completely out of their depth. It took the Democrats until Bill Clinton to reinvent themselves. On the other hand, the Republicans after George W. Bush seemed like they were, pundits in 2009 were saying they were on path to being a regional party, and then in 2010 they won 63 House seats. So, it's hard to say. I will say that the hole that Joe Biden, and frankly, they dug for themselves. They were involved every step of the way. I mean, you can push this onto Biden as much as you want, but the reality is that it was a party-wide effort.
That's really true, actually. It's funny because, of course, people like to blame Biden for a lot, and he deserves a lot of criticism. But, of course, Kamala Harris was an author of this. But the truth is that we can't pinpoint it. I've been looking at some of the data that Kristen, our producer, prepared for this podcast. And what I see is a Democratic Party that is so out of touch with the mainstream of American political views that, to me, it's amazing they've been losing at the speed they've been losing. I would have thought that they were losing faster. But now, enough editorial comment. But the proximate cause of getting you on to join us and talk to us about this was this huge piece that was the talk of the town in the New York Times toward the end of August, called "The Democratic Party's Voter Registration Crisis." And I mean, it was a huge bombshell, even for the New York Times, which is the House newspaper of the Democratic Party in so many ways. Talk a little bit about what you see as the Democratic Party's problems nationwide.
I think what a major problem that they're having is that historically the Democratic Party has been a coalition of minority voters. And I think, or not exclusively minority voters, but predominantly, approximately half of the Democratic Party vote is minority, basically. And I think that after the Obama presidency, there was a conviction that was going to be the way of the future. That, it's interesting, after 2004, Howard Dean said we need to get into pickup trucks and we need to drive through the Deep South with gun racks. And then Barack Obama went in the opposite direction and I think convinced the party that the future was minority, ethnic and racial minorities. And at least for Obama, it worked. But I think what has happened here is that between a combination of inflation and immigration, I think that they have managed to antagonize a wide swath of young-ish minority men. And I think that I think there was a cynicism to their allowing the border to be open, thinking that these illegal immigrants would be future Democratic voters, or they would have children who would be Democratic voters, and that therefore it would tip the scales. I think that they were trying to tamper with the composition of the electorate with this immigration transformation. But it backfired on them because these immigrants predominantly moved into low to middle income communities that were already, you had Mexican Americans or Latino Americans, African Americans living there. And, so much of government services are provided on a local level, and you're straining local resources and transforming communities overnight. Nobody likes that. I don't care what party you are. Nobody wants to have their community transformed overnight in ways you don't have any sovereignty over. And you combine that with inflation. And the interesting thing I think about inflation is that if you have been invested in the market, inflation has not been that bad because the market has inflated as well. Asset prices have inflated. So if you own a home, or if you have a 401k account, now that's not to say you haven't borne the effects of inflation, but they've been mitigated. But if most of your income is consumed every month, then you have really very little benefit from inflation. You're just paying the burden of it. And so I think that's another thing that's happened as well, is that younger working class people who don't necessarily have assets yet are just paying just price increases. And I think the response from the Democrats was largely to gaslight them, to say, oh, well, prices aren't up that much, or, inflation has dropped like from 7% to 5%, like completely denying the difference between the first and second derivative. And I think on top of that, I think that the transgender thing and the party's seeming like addiction to elite cultural niche issues and imposing these niche moral views on the rest of society is just alienating to so many people. They just seem like they're out of touch. They seem like they're out of touch. And I think that, look, if you went back 30 years, to say 1995, you would have minority communities that would have distinct firsthand memories of the racial discrimination of the 60s and before. You don't really have that anymore. I think the Supreme Court might very well strike down Section 2 of the VRA because there really isn't widespread racial discrimination in voting anymore. And so that, like in 2012 or whatever, Biden, said they're going to put you all back in chains, famously about Mitt Romney, of all the people to say that about. But I'm not sure how much that appeal works anymore as we move further and further away in time from the period of segregation. And you see this in other ways too. You see, like, for instance, black migration is moving southward. African Americans who fled the South are returning. They left Alabama to go to New York, and now they're coming back to Alabama, which is remarkable. So I'm not really sure that those old historic linkages are as powerful as they used to be.
So there's so many threads to pull in what you just said, but let's talk a little bit about the Obama years, because I think that's the root of their problem. So if you look at like the Gallup approval of the Democratic Party, I think it's the Gallup one, they haven't been above 50% since Bill Clinton, right? They've been on if you look at it, it's like it's a fairly steady trajectory down to now in the low 30s. But they've been on a decline, and Democrats look and say, yeah, well, we had 2 terms of Bill Clinton, and then we had 2 terms of Bush, and then we had a great 2-term run with Obama. And I would say hold it a little bit there. Obama, yeah, he won re-election, but Democrats lost, I actually crunched the numbers, 1,027 elected offices under Barack Obama. They started out when he came into office with a 60-seat filibuster-proof majority. They lost 257 seats in the House, which was the largest minority since the Clinton years. And on their watch, they lost 12 Senate seats, 63 House seats, 939 Democratic legislative seats, and a dozen governor's office, which is the largest loss of power since the 50s. That was a disastrous period for them. I mean, yes, he was managed to win re-election, but if they're looking at that as and then, by the way, the greatest repudiation was that Americans' response to 8 years of Barack Obama was Donald Trump.
Yeah. I
would think they ought to be looking back to the Clinton model, not the Obama model, as their path out of the wilderness. Am I wrong?
No, I don't think you are. I mean, I do. I think that the Obama administration was catastrophically bad from their perspective. When we think about it in the context of what they had January 2009, they had the first African-American president with universal just acclaim. Even his political opponents were just awestruck that an African-American could be elected president. To your point, Mark, they had overwhelming majorities in the House and the Senate. They had an economy that was in free fall. I mean, that was we were literally, I think it was March 2009 that the economy finally hit bottom. And people who are old enough to remember that period from September of 2008 to March of 2009 will recall you just never knew what you were going to wake up to the next morning in terms of what's the next domino going to fall. The level of political power that he wielded in that moment has only ever been wielded by a handful of presidents. Lyndon Johnson in 1963, 64, Franklin Roosevelt in 1933, and he absolutely squandered it. He pulled off a merging of corporate interests with the Democratic Party between the Affordable Care Act and between Dodd-Frank. He merged corporate America and the Democratic Party on cultural issues and a kind of managed bull moose progressivism that is wholly unpalatable to the broad swath of Americans, including many of Obama's voters. If you look at Obama's coalition in the upper Midwest, huge swaths of the rural white working class has abandoned the Democrats and gone to Trump, because the Democratic Party is like the party of, somehow now they're the party of corporate America. I cannot believe that the Democrats decided to adopt, like, of all of the times to adopt corporate America over the last 15 years. I mean, this is a time corporate America's esteem in the public mind is lower than it's ever been probably since the Depression. And now they're just identified completely with the cultural interests and the managed progressive grand bargain bull mooserism of the Obama administration, all of which is just so unappetizing to the American people. The fact that that's what he did is just remarkable. And the only substantive policy accomplishment that he had was a massive expansion of Medicaid, which is a broken program to begin with, not a reform of Medicaid, but just a massive expansion of Medicaid. That's what they have to show for those 8 years is just remarkable to me.
So I have a theory. You can tell me whether I'm wrong or not. But I mean, if you just look at the electoral, except for the 2012 election, if you look at the midterms, if you look at all the state and local elections, if you look at the 2016 election, it's all a repudiation of Obama. The only time that he wasn't repudiated was when he was on the ballot. And I think part of that is because Mitt Romney was a terrible candidate. But part of that, I think, the Democrats always have this theory that we're a systemically racist country. I think a lot of Americans didn't want the first black president to fail. I think they're good people. They wanted the first black president to succeed. They didn't want him to be a first-term president, so they gave him a lot more grace than they would have given another politician. Is that a crazy theory?
No, it's not. And I think the other thing too is that one of the look, Obama won fewer popular votes in 2012 than he did in 2008. He won fewer electoral college votes, and he won a smaller share of the popular vote. In 4 years, his coalition, by every objective metric, declined. Which now he was advantaged, I think, in two respects. The first one is that his initial coalition was very large, and then I think that he was able in 2012 to effectively say, look, the economy is not going nearly as well as we want. It's certainly not going as well as it had been, as I promised it would be. But they're the ones who ruined it. I mean, I remember in 2012, one of his rhetorical things was, if somebody drives a car into a ditch, and a tow truck comes to pull it out, you're not going to take advice from the guy who drove it into the ditch. I think rhetorically that had a lot of firepower, especially because Romney, who I think ran, I thought Romney ran a reasonably good campaign, but I think that his profile as an individual, having been at Bain Capital and also very clearly being from, the establishment wing of the Republican Party, the sort of the people who had been in charge. And so he represented the people who had done this in the first place, I think was sufficient to get Obama across the finish line.
I have a question here that comes from this conversation about, the particular character and personality of the candidates. Because in the era of Donald Trump, the Democratic Party relies a great deal on people who hate Donald Trump, not people who love them. And in that period of time, per this New York Times article, the Democratic Party has lost 4.5 million voters. I mean, that's a lot of voters. Of the 30 states that track voter registration by political party, Democrats lost ground to Republicans in every single one between 2020 and 2024. For the first time since 2018, more new voters nationwide chose to be Republicans in 2024 than Democrats. Right? They lost in every possible way. They went from an 11 percentage point edge over Republicans on Election Day in 2020. They lost in North Carolina 95% of their registration advantage. And the litany goes on and on and on. And I'm trying to understand, right? Should the Republicans be thinking gleefully, Donald Trump is actually the greatest thing since sliced bread? I believe I'm quoting Mark Thiessen directly there. Or do the Democrats just absolutely suck. Yeah. And
Or both.
or both. But I mean, I do think this is an important question because there's always every time there's a new president, there's a new conceit. You talk about this really in this great July article. We'll link to it that you wrote about the importance of cohabitation, as the French call it, right, which is divided government. You said every single time the Republicans are like, right, unbeatable coalition for the future. And the Democrats are like, we'll never lose again. And each time they get washed up on shore looking like dead fish because their predictions were so bad. So that was a highly convoluted question. But is it that the GOP is amazing, or is it that the Democrats suck, or is it a combo of the two?
I don't think the GOP is amazing.
Good.
I think
Me
that the Democratic Party, there's sort of among, or X, I guess it's now called, on X, there's sort of a joke, a goof among a lot of conservative wags that the Democrats have a staffing problem. And I think there's a lot to that, actually. I think that the Democrats have really just lost touch with what is going on in the country. I'm not sure how that happened. I do think it might be because, frankly, the younger progressive Democrats who are staffing these campaigns are really left-wing, like really left-wing. Like they're the ones driving these land acknowledgements. I mean, you see these sorts of situations where these middle-aged...
That was insane.
Yeah, these middle-aged politicians are like... Oh,
welcome to Australia.
Somebody's like, oh, we need to do a land acknowledgement. And the middle-aged, Democrat politicians like, oh, okay. Like... That's this, like they wouldn't, the leadership of the party is not going to think to do stuff like that. I think that's a staffing problem. I think that the Republicans the Republicans, for as much as they like to talk about the Republican Party as being a bunch of fascists, the Republican Party is still your father's Republican Party. I'm sorry, but it is. Regardless of the fact that Donald Trump is not your father's Republican. The Republican Party remains basically the party of the National Federation of Independent Business and your local non-denominational Protestant church. Like if you take these two groups and sort of define their values sort of, as universalistically as you can, that's still the Republican Party, right? So like like business regulations reduced, taxes lowered, commitment to traditional moral values, whatever that is in that moment, that's still the party. It's still the same thing. And it still has all of the advantages and disadvantages that it always did. I've thought this for a while, that a lot of the reaction about Trump has been wrapped up in this, the wrong sort of person has become president. The presidency is supposed to be occupied. Now, I'm speaking sort of allegorically. Presidency is supposed to be occupied by a Manhattanite. It's not supposed to be occupied by somebody from Queens.
Well, it is.
Yeah. And I mean, even presidents who are sort of culturally like outsiders, like Bill Clinton, nevertheless fit really seamlessly into that kind of elite, kind of executive, elitist kind of, vibe. And Trump is just conscientiously not of that cut at all. And I think that creates a lot of the outrage about him. But I think nevertheless, like if you look at the actual substantive policies, I mean, even his great heresy against the Republican Party orthodoxy, which is tariffs, was in fact the staple of Republican economic policy from the Civil War up through the Great Depression. So even that, he's just more of a Henry Cabot Lodge Republican than a Ronald Reagan Republican. I just see the guy basically as a Republican, frankly.
So let me push back a little bit on your thesis, because I think it is the Republican Party is still the Republican Party of your fathers and grandfathers, but plus, right? So what Trump has done is he's brought in a huge swath of the working class and made it the working class party. And the Democrats used to be the party of the working class and minorities, right? Mm-hmm. And now they've lost the working class. They're losing a segment of minorities who are going Republican. And so they're a diminished party of minorities and coastal elites. I mean, that's a structural problem for them.
It is.
That the Republicans have managed on a deep structural level to maintain the old coalition. They've lost some suburban voters who don't like particularly suburban women. They have got troubles there, but they've more than made up with it with working class voters, and no taxes on tips and all the rest of that feeds that. And the Democrats are left with this sort of dwindling minorities. In order to make up for that, they have to get supermajorities, unprecedented supermajorities of minorities and then sort of bleeding minorities. And then they've got the progressive coastal elites, and they can't seem to figure out how to fix that structural defect.
Yeah, I think a major part of the puzzle here has been the collapse of American industrial and trade labor. Labor unions during Eisenhower's presidency, about 1 in 4 American workers were in a labor union. Now it's closer to 1 in 10. And if you factor out the government unions, it's even less. And if you factor out what you might call the gray collar unions, the service unions like the SEIU, it's even less than that. The labor unions did 2 things for the Democrats. The first one, all the way back in the 30s and 40s, is they seized a huge chunk of the working class away from the Republican Party. Because the Republicans, like if you go back to the late 1800s, you'll see it's the Republicans who were the ones who were appealing to workers in the cities. Because they would make an argument that, our policies are good for the economy, and so therefore they'll be good for you. Well, with the rise of organized labor and its sort of government sanctioned under Roosevelt, really undercut that alliance. So it is what brought a huge chunk of the working class over to the Democratic Party. But then the other thing I think as well is that labor unions were always sort of a counterbalance to, especially starting in the 50s and 60s, a counterbalance to the concerns of highly educated liberals. So the Democrats had this internal dynamic where they'd have to balance, say, environmentalism with economic growth because labor unions had a significant seat at the table. But now organized labor is a shell of its former self. Now they're just part of the intersectional coalition. I mean, even now, even when we say, the steelworkers, how many members of the steelworkers union are actually graduate students in English departments across the country? And so as a consequence, the Democratic Party, their internal conversation with themselves, as they're sort of struggling to formulate positions and understand what's going on, there's really nobody in the coalition, in the people, the organizations and entities and factions that have a seat at the table. There's nobody in that coalition to speak for the concerns that, say, like George Meany of the AFL-CIO in the 1960s would be able to speak for. Like, he'd go in and talk to Lyndon Johnson in the Oval Office, and he could speak on behalf of lunch pail guys across the country. There's nobody like that in the party now to talk to them and to say, hey, this is a little too much. I think that's a huge problem, is that the collapse of organized labor opened up political pathways to Republicans because Republicans were able to win these voters over. But then also, I think more significantly, it just denied the Democrats of an important perspective within their own internal conversations.
So yesterday was Labor Day. That's why I was sort of listening, entranced to you talk about unions and about their loss of power. National Review had a piece by the editors yesterday about Labor Day, and some of the statistics were absolutely remarkable. If you don't include public sector unions, which should be illegal but are not everywhere, labor union membership is under 6% in the United States. Labor unions lost ground in the most pro-labor union administration, arguably, the Biden administration, than in decades, lost ground every single year. So I think you're exactly right. Labor unions are simply a reflection of the Democratic corporate media complex that people are freaking sick and tired of. The question is, what's the other side? Because the Democrats are going to gain ground in the midterm election in 2026. They always do. They're going to have to. How do you see that shaking out? And as you talk about that and the trends that you see going forward, first of all, let's keep in mind Donald Trump is in his second term. Donald Trump is 78 or 79 years old at this point. All the health stuff is garbage, but he's not, he's certainly no spring chicken. He's not Joe Biden, but he's not Kamala Harris either in the generational sweepstakes. So what are we looking at in trends? And if you want to squeeze it in, but it's really a question by itself, we can talk about redistricting too, but I think that's a better separate question.
Sure. I think within the Republican coalition, there's been a debate about whether or not Trumpism will survive Trump and whether or not Trump's a one-off. I think that the lawfare against the president has thoroughly radicalized a broad and wide swath of Republican elites, particularly younger elites, who now see, that when they use, they don't talk about the bureaucracy. They talk about the deep state. I think that the failure to produce any substantive claims on Russian collusion has transformed a lot of Republicans. And I look at J.D. Vance as a good example of this. I think if you went back to 2015, you would not see J.D. Vance talking the way that he talks. I think that and part of it, I'm sure, part of it, I'm sure, is, look, he was running for Senate and he's a politician and they change and things like that. But I know a lot of Republicans who just, it was a shocking thing to witness that when everything was said and done, there was nothing there. And I think so that the Republican Party's not going back in terms of the approach towards the government bureaucracy, U.S. aid is not coming back. That's not going to be brought back by a Republican president, like a President Vance or President Rubio or President DeSantis is not going to bring that back. I think that's certainly the case. I think there's probably less commitment among Republicans to Trump's trade regime. I think a lot less, actually. I think a lot of Republicans are, he's been campaigning on this for 20 years. We're just going to let him cook. I think that's a vibe among Republicans, not a great deal of conviction. So I do think that sort of the Mitt Romney Republicanism, at least on economic policy, could come back in some. But then again, it depends, because I think which faction in the party are we looking at? Because, you could look at a Senator Hawley and compare him to others in the party. Hawley would definitely keep the tariffs up. So there's a lot of churn within the Republican Party at this point. But I do think that whatever happens in 2028 is going to be conditioned in large part on Trump's endorsement. So I'm not sure that there's going to be a full-blown ideological internal battle in 2028. I think the more interesting story is with the Democrats. And I think almost always the more interesting story is with the out party. Because the out party has to do two things, neither of which is obvious. They have to figure out why they lost, and they have to have a correct answer for that. And then they have to figure out, okay, what's the alternative that can produce victory? And a lot of times out parties will misunderstand the reason that they lost and then offer somebody who's completely bland and anodyne. So a good example of that, for instance, in 1996, the Republicans offered Bob Dole. Not really the kind of change agent you'd want to see. Or in 2004, the Democrats offered John Kerry. They do that. This happens a lot. So it'll be interesting to see how the Democrats navigate their various factional conflicts. Because the other thing, too, is that all of this happens within the broader psychological dynamic of politics, which is that nobody ever acknowledges the unpopularity of their own personally held, deeply held views. Nobody acknowledges, I really screwed that up. So every faction is the three of us can look at the Democratic Party and say, are you kidding me with AOC? That's insane. But there are people in the Democratic Party who say, no, actually the solution to our problem is more AOC. We need more of this. And so who knows what they're going to, because that's going to be just one crazy internal battle that's going to be fought in a very relatively brief span of time. And it also depends on who actually runs, like who's actually going to throw their hat into the ring. And not only that, but who's actually going to be a impressive candidate. Like for instance, right now, everybody's like, wow, look at Gavin Newsom. He's like posting, posting, posting all the time. But he could absolutely flame out as a candidate. I remember in 2015, I was like, the future belongs to Scott Walker. And then, I saw him give a speech where he talked like way too much about coals. And I was like, oh no, the future does not belong to Scott. So it depends. Like, it'll depend on who's got the juice in the party. It'll be fascinating to watch. And I don't pretend to know what the Democrats would do. And if I were a Democrat, I would not take advice from somebody like myself either. So I don't know.
Well, the Democrats aren't taking advice from Rui Teixeira either, who's certainly a Democrat, or from lots of other Democrats who are advising them. So you mentioned the magic word though in there, and I wanted to follow up. So one of the other polls that was really interesting to me was that 4 in 10 Americans have a favorable view of Bernie Sanders. About half of Democrats, in other words, more Democrats, have a favorable view of Ocasio-Cortez. She is much more popular than Chuck Schumer. In other words, it's not so much that the party needs to recognize that it has to hew to the center. It is that the party is lurching aggressively to the left and stymieing its own ability to pick up center uncommitted voters, swing voters. I mean, to me, this is staggering that actually the center of gravity of the Democratic Party has, in light of everything that has happened, has actually been, is moving further left.
Yeah, it is remarkable. And let me just say, too, this sort of relates, is that they have been ignoring Rui Teixeira for a quarter century. And they systematically, I cannot wrap my mind around how the book that he and John Judas wrote, which was a very sensible book about building a multi-ethnic coalition focused upon worker concerns and basic policy moderation, became the text of democracy or demographics is destiny. I do not understand how they did that. But yeah, I think that I think both parties have this challenge. I'm not sure who has it worse. Maybe the Democrats do. I don't know. But both parties have it, which is that the people who are the most engaged in democratic politics, and by that in the leadership, I don't mean that, but I mean like in the donor class and even in these polls. The polls are always going to be biased to the people who are most likely to answer a poll, regardless of whatever controls a pollster puts on it. You have a base of highly engaged people, and the highly engaged people on the Democratic side, I think, are very ideological, and I think they are more ideological than they have been in a long time. Like you used to look at polls and you'd see like Democrats would see themselves as moderates, and like now they see themselves as progressives. And I think that has to do with who's the most engaged people within the Democratic Party. I mean, because you need to sort of differentiate, ideological disposition to partisan commitment. So like, for instance, you could have stalwart African Americans who vote Democrat every time, but are fundamentally moderate in their politics, right? And in fact, the African Americans have been imposing a kind of moderating force in the party for quite some time. They're the ones who, skunked Bernie twice, right? It was the moderates in the party who did the moderate African Americans in the party. And I think this increasing number of highly engaged, progressive, I think predominantly white, socioeconomically upscale. And you see this with a lot of their small donors, like the Democrats, like these certain candidates who are in these hopeless races can just, raise $100 million as if it were nothing. And I think that's a big reason why. And I think that unfortunately, this is a group of people who are particularly out of touch, I think. I just so as an example of that, I don't know if you guys saw the other day, there was at some protest in Virginia, and some old woman, white woman, had this sign up that made a point like, like to Winsome Earl Seals, like, if transgender people can't use bathrooms, you can't use my bathroom. And it was like, people, and this was a thing. I mean, it was a thing on Twitter, and people were sort of like reacting like, oh, this is insane. Like, this is insane. What is going on here? This is insane. And I thought to myself, I think there are people in the country who compare in like a non-ironic fashion the transgender movement to the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Those are your donors and your thought leaders. Yikes. Yikes.
Yikes is the right word.
It is. So, I mean, we here can sit around and give the obvious advice to the Democrats, and they probably ought to listen to us, but they won't, which is less socialism, more triangulation.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's your path back out of the political wilderness, right?
Yep.
And that's unlikely because the party is now taken over by the progressive wing, and so they're very unlikely to say, yeah, our beliefs are unpopular, so therefore we're not going to campaign on them. They're going to be more likely to double down. But they're also more likely to double down because they'll say, well, that's not what the Republicans did to beat us after Biden. They doubled down on, MAGA. They doubled down on their extreme. So the path in this whole model of politics, which was you campaign to your base and then you move to the center in the election and try to win over the swing voters, has sort of yielded to a model of you campaign to your base and then you double down on your base and you make the people in the middle choose between the two extremes.
Yeah.
So why would they even listen to us? Now, my answer to that would be because your crazy ideas are unpopular and the Republican Party's more extreme ideas are actually more popular. So you're doubling down on defeat.
Yeah, I think, this is where your own perception of political reality can end up skewing your objective analysis. And I'll give you an example of that. I mean, people who say, like, the Trump administration's approach to immigration is extreme, that to me is insane.
Oh, I agree with that.
I mean, this was...
Democratic approach to immigration was extreme.
Like,
and
there
insane.
there was, like, I remember in 2008, I think it was 2008, which is not that long ago. At a Democratic debate in 2008, there was a question of, would you be willing to give driver's license to illegal immigrants? And most of the people who answered no. And I think that if you asked most average Americans, should we be giving driver's license to illegal immigrants, they would say, yeah, that's not a good idea. Or, like, should we just open the borders up to anybody? No, that's not a good idea. If you're in this country, should you leave? Yes, you should. Like, this is all a recent innovation of, like, the last 5 or 6 years that, frankly, I'm not sure where they got this idea in their head. And I would add as well that I think that the immigration issue has been an issue that has, if you look at the polls, the American people have been more restrictionist on immigration than both political parties have been for a long time. And one of the reasons I believe that Donald Trump became the nominee for two, he said two things. The first one was, we got to build a wall. And that spoke to immigration. And the second thing was the Iraq War was a mistake. And I think when he said that, Republican voters who regretted that war were like, oh, wow, finally, we can say that now as Republicans. And, like, so for the Democrats to look at immigration and, like, see Trump as actually, like, a pretty clever policy entrepreneur on this issue, as, like, figuring out that there was a niche, there was a view that was not being served. And like, so we're going to cut in the exact opposite direction is, to me, just extraordinary. And, like, if you compare what the Democrats are now saying about immigration to things as recently as the early 2000s, they're like night and day. like Bernie Sanders before Donald Trump came along, Bernie Sanders was making the very obvious point that, a surge in low-skilled immigration is going to drive wages down among low-skilled workers. And I'm a guy who's committed to economic equality, so this is bad. And now you can't even say that. You can't even think it in the Democratic Party now. To me, that's just a sign of when people talk about MAGA, I mean, there are certain MAGA things that are extreme. But, curtailing immigration, eliminating taxes on tips, and eliminating taxes on Social Security, it's not like this is like the policy agenda of the monopoly man. You know what I mean? Which is not to say that I agree with everything. I'm not saying that I agree with this. I'm sympathetic to the immigration arguments, particularly. I'm not in love with the tax policy. But just as a purely political perspective, like the idea that no taxes on tips is like a radical right-wing idea, I mean, it's not. It's not great economics, but it's not like, it's not like JP Morgan type of stuff.
It really is. I love where this conversation has gone, because you're exactly right. And people should have a little bit of a vibe shift about how they're thinking about the Democratic Party, because it is at once radical and corporatist. And it is really interesting to see that our corporations, while I think they're rethinking this a little bit, really, the whole Budweiser, Dylan, whatever her name is, was not an anomaly. It was really actually of a piece with where things are going. Okay, exit question for me. Let's talk about redistricting. How's this going to end? Texas, California, New York, where else?
Well, the big thing is Section 2 of the VRA. If the court strikes that down in the next 10 months, then the fight over Texas is going to look like, I don't know, the War of 1812 compared to the Napoleonic Wars. Like, it will be a next level. Every state that has a minority majority district, there is going to be an equal protection claim. If the Supreme Court just says, guess what, racial gerrymandering's off the table, that's going to be an absolute. Now, if that happens, which is an if, but honestly, I don't know, my money's on it happening, will be a complete game changer. So much of the Democratic power base in the House of Representatives is built on Section 2 of the VRA and minority majority districts. Even like South Carolina could redistrict Clyburn out. Like, that's what we're talking about here. They could gerrymander, they could redraw the maps, and Clyburn would no longer be in the House. So with that caveat in mind, I think that the Republican Party has realized that the 2020 redistricting battle, they lost. I think they've realized that they lost that. I think that they realized that certain states like Illinois and New York and Maryland were super aggressive, and seemingly nonpartisan redistricting proposals like in New Jersey and California were effectively partisan gerrymanders. And I think like the way to look at what the Republicans are doing, almost like if you have a piece of furniture that you put together, and you get it from IKEA and you turn all the screws and it's a little wobbly, you go back and you sort of tighten all the screws. That's what I think they're doing. I think what they're doing is, okay, wow, we have to look at what the Democrats did in Illinois. And substantively, the reality is that the Build Back Better bill, they had to make carve-outs for Northeastern Republicans on the SALT deduction because they didn't pull enough seats out of places like Missouri, Florida, Texas, and things like that. So I think the other thing that's going on here, when we're thinking about this redistricting, is potentially for if they can hold the line in the House, which is a big if, but you hold the line in the House with tightening up the redistricting, and then in 2027 you do a more conservative, a Build Back Better, or not Build Back Better, One Big Beautiful Bill. Sorry, that was quite a mind gap there. Trump's one, not Biden's Build Back Better.
Well,
Trump's
they're both BBB.
Right? Yeah, I know. That's what it was. I think they might be thinking like that angle too, and I think that if you're looking at and again, let's just assume that the court doesn't do anything on VRA Section 2. There is definitely more juice for the Republicans to squeeze than there is for the Democrats. The Democrats are already pretty squeezed. Could they get rid of the Maryland district? Sure, probably. They can probably manage to do that. Can they pick up 5 seats in California? Yeah, they probably can do that. But look, between Texas, between Ohio, between Indiana, between Missouri, between Florida, and you can just sort of imagine Republicans in Nebraska looking at what the Democrats are doing and thinking, okay, well, we're going to toss in on this too. And I would add as well, J.D. Vance has introduced a rhetorical, I think gives cover and maybe puts pressure on those sort of like good government Republicans, like in Nebraska. Nebraska Republicans are always going to be hesitant to play politics with a pair of brass knuckles on. It's just the style of Nebraska politics. But Vance has sort of said, like illegals are counting for the purposes of apportionment in California, and so that's a drain of representation away from us and towards them, and we have to make that up somewhere. And I've thought for a while that Republicans should be making that argument about illegal immigration because illegals count for the purposes of apportionment. And like, I live in Western Pennsylvania, and we've been bleeding seats here for 30 years, and I look at that and I think, I don't understand why Pennsylvania Republicans aren't making that argument. I think that argument has got some legs on it, potentially, as it not necessarily among the masses because it's a little too inside baseball, but at least among elites to say like, look, the rules as they are right now favor them, and the Democrats, like, this is the other thing too, their mass invitation of illegal immigrants into the country is effectively going to purchase like 3 or 4 seats for them. Unless we get these people out of here. And so we need to, like they're playing games with this stuff. Why can't we just tighten up? And I think the Republicans, there's a lot of tightening they can do. Whether or not that's enough to stop what happens in 2026, I mean, who knows? Midterm elections are always such a surprise. And, it's a fool's errand to try and predict what's going to happen in a midterm election.
Well, Jay, I think, first of all, I think it's insane that illegals are counted towards apportionment. I just never have understood that. And so I think that's a very good issue for Republicans to take, quite frankly, it's a pretty simple issue to make to the American people, but especially in this anti-illegal immigrant atmosphere today. But also the Democrats like trying to escalate this. It's like you never escalate a war you can't win. The Republicans have unified control of government in 23 states. The Democrats have it in 14.
Yeah.
So if they, if they respond to Texas by doing it in California, there's more Republican, states that can do this and override the Democrats to do it than there are Democratic states. Yeah. So I just think it's a kamikaze mission. It's ridiculous.
Well, I think I agree, but I do think what's driving this is Gavin Newsom's presidential ambitions.
Oh, sure.
And I think from Newsom's perspective, I mean, he's got to win that referendum. Will he win it? I don't know, because who knows. But let's assume that if he loses the referendum, then his political aspirations are finished, I think. But let's assume he wins the referendum. If he wins that referendum and he can redesign the maps, then he can go out in 2027 when he's campaigning among the progressive donor class and say, look, I fought. I did everything I could. How come other Democrats didn't do that? And without, pointing out, like, of course, Pritzker can't do that because there's only 3. They've gerrymandered Illinois into something that's unrecognizable. We should really, at this point, it's sort of an insult to Elbridge Gerry to continue to call it a gerrymander when J.B. Pritzker has done what he did we should really start renaming it a Pritzkermander. But even though Pritzker did everything that he could in 2020 and 2022 to draw those maps, like Illinois Democrats are all in. But Newsom can say, oh, look what I did, like when you were all paying attention to this. Like, I think a lot of this is just the presidential ambitions of Gavin Newsom.
Interesting. All right, Mark, we've been talking to Jay for not just the half an hour we asked for, but
we should stop telling people we're going to put them on for half an hour because I don't think we ever stick to the half hour.
I know, but I think people are more amenable to
because
half
these
an hour.
Conversations are so interesting. Nobody wants to stop, Danny. That's why. And that's why our listeners are still listening now, 55 minutes in.
Yes, I hope that's true.
Me too.
Anyway, Jay, you've been amazing. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Of course.
As usual, Mark and I, love these conversations and we learn so much. So fantastic. I really appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me, guys. Anytime.
All right.
Amazing.
Take care.
Take care.
So I think Jay is right that if Gavin Newsom loses this referendum, it's damaging to him. But on the other hand, what's damaging to him is that his state is a basket case, and he still seems to be, competitive for the Democratic primary. I remember I think Gavin Newsom is incredibly dangerous because people dismiss him because California's a basket case. He's the first governor since the founding of the California Republic where more people have left the state than come in, right?
What would you do? Would you live in California?
You know what? I go to California lately probably 4 or 5 times a year, and I love California. It's one of the most beautiful places on the face of the earth. And I wouldn't live there for anything. I love showing up. I don't want to live there. I don't want to own property there. I don't want to pay taxes there. I unfortunately have to pay gas taxes there when I visit, but that's about it. So I can enjoy California without all the downsides of it. But no, I wouldn't live in California for anything. It really, every time I go to California, I look at the natural beauty of that place and I think, you really have to be stupid to fuck this up. How do you take this and make people leave? It takes a certain special talent to drive people out. But Gavin Newsom is an incredibly talented, skillful politician. He's incredibly likable. And the evidence of that, watch one of these days, sit back and watch the debate that he had with Ron DeSantis on Hannity, right? DeSantis destroyed him on points, right? I mean, DeSantis is running the best run state in the country. Newsom is running the worst run state in the country. And on the points, on the data, on the everything, DeSantis won that debate hands down. Gavin Newsom was so likable and so charming. And I looked at that debate and I thought we won that debate and we could lose that election if that was what we were facing. He's a very, very talented politician, and the fact that anyone's talking about him despite all the disasters that he's presided over is evidence of that. So I would be very careful of Gavin Newsom.
Yeah. No, I think that's a word to the wise. And you know what? He's not old. He's not Bernie Sanders.
Yep.
He's not
good looking, charming.
Good looking, charming. He's not radicalizing, alienating like AOC, like Rashda Tlaib, like Ilhan Omar, like those people.
He's as progressive as they are without being as off-putting.
Exactly. Yeah. And he's also not a simp like Pete Buttigieg. He's not, he's not somebody where you just want to slap him, which is how I feel about, Pete Buttigieg. And who was that guy who just wouldn't freaking go away in Texas? Beto O'Rourke.
Beto.
Remember the expression metrosexual? That's what they are.
I don't think Buttigieg is a metrosexual, but yes.
Well, that's true. He's not a heterosexual either. But I don't think that's the problem. The problem, I think, just as I think Americans were totally willing to elect a black man, I think they're totally willing to elect a gay man, but they're not willing to elect somebody who's a simp. And that's the problem with those two guys. Gavin Newsom doesn't have that problem. You're right. So I just wrote a piece. I don't know what you wanted to say, but I just wrote a piece for my good friends in Australia that run the Australia-Israel Jewish Affairs Committee, which is sort of AIPAC-ish, AIPAC-like in Australia. And it's one of lots of Jewish organizations. But I wrote about the Democratic Party because I think there is that while the Australian left has absolutely gone bananas, is pro-Hamas. The prime minister is pro-Hamas. The foreign minister is pro-Hamas. They are a part of something that started overseas, but that we are now seeing on the American left, which is that the Democratic Party is now majority anti-Israel. And all of the most recent polls show it. But what was absolutely fascinating to me in the course of writing this piece is that I went and looked at Gallup polling, historical polling, and what you can see is support for Israel. Right? The Democratic Party was a bastion of support for Israel for decades. That line is coming from the top and going down, and the line in support of quote unquote Palestine or Palestinians or however you phrase it is going up. That line crossed not after 2023 when people began to criticize Israel for the fake genocide that they're being accused of or the fake famine they're being accused of. It happened in 2022. And that tells us everything you need to know about the Democratic Party. And the American people remain pro-Israel. Right? The American people are pro-Israel. The Democratic Party is anti-Israel. Yes, people don't all vote on Israel, but this is just another sign of how out of touch they are.
Yeah. Well, so on 2 points on foreign policy. One is that the problem we discussed with Jay was the lurch to the left of the Democratic Party, which I think is a problem. But it's the lurch to the left combined with the incompetence, right? And some on the right may say, but you repeat yourself. but the reality is that Biden's decline, and Biden lost that election because he was the worst president, probably not just since Jimmy Carter, but even worse than Jimmy Carter. And it started with the worst foreign policy debacle in my lifetime, which was the Afghan withdrawal. He had above 50% approval until the Afghan withdrawal. It dropped down and never recovered. And so foreign policy, people don't go into the voting booth voting on Afghanistan or voting on the Iran nuclear program or voting on Ukraine, but they do go into the voting booth voting on competence. And you look at the world, and they left us a world that seemed to be in chaos, right? Biden inherited a world that was at peace, the Abraham Accords, and he left a world that was on fire. And you combine that with the incompetence at the border and the incompetence in executing our foreign policy, and that's something that people do vote on. And so until the Democrats can contend with their foreign policy failures and convince people that they will not be incompetent coming in, then they're going to lose. And that leads me to the other thing. Jay put an idea about a column in my mind that I'm going to write. But he was saying that the reason Trump won was, 1, immigration, and 2, he was willing to say the Iraq war was a mistake. Now, you and I can debate that, I don't want to have that debate here. But
good, because I would win.
But we can have that discussion at some point. But the border is the Democrats' Iraq. And until they are willing to turn around and say, we screwed up, and we're not going to do what Trump did on Iraq, whether you think that's right or wrong, that did change the dynamic politically for him. And I think they need to do the same thing when it comes to the border. Somebody needs to step up and say, you know what? The Democratic Party screwed up on immigration.
Sister soldier moment. They're looking for
soldier moment, but more like a Donald Trump Iraq war moment. Saying that the leaders of the Democratic Party in the Biden years were incompetent. And we need competent leadership. And I don't see anybody.
All the Democrats I know think that, and obviously,
but they won't say it.
But people are.
But you need a candidate who's willing to say what Trump said was, Trump went and said he attacked not just the Democrats' foreign policy, but the Republicans' foreign policy, and said everybody who came before me, whether they were Republican or Democrat, were stupid people and incompetent. And I'm going to fix it.
I love that about him.
To win, you need a Democrat who's willing to say the same thing about his own party.
Right. But of course, that gets more and more difficult. Donald Trump is an unbelievably unusual personality, and he has a base that exists on his own charisma, personality, and history. He is, he's a snake oil salesman. He's a showman, not necessarily snake oil, but he's
a showman for sure.
He's an evangelist in that way, and sometimes it's snake oil. But for the Democrats, it's going to be harder and harder to do this for the very simple reason that the party has moved so far to the left. Because it's one thing to yank people from Jimmy Carter to Bill Clinton, and another thing to yank people from Joe Biden and Barack Obama to Bill Clinton. That's a long jump for these guys, and it is going to be very hard. And increasingly, the people who are telling them the things that you're saying today, whether it's you who are a Republican or it's Rui Teixeira who is 70, are older. And the younger part of the party is radical, far left. I think it'll take somebody, it'll take that knight in shining armor that you talked about that was needed for the Republican Party, for the Democrats, and I'm not sure. I don't think that's Gavin Newsom. I hope it isn't, because I don't think Gavin Newsom represents a shift, a yank to the center. We'll see.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Well, they need it. They need their own Donald Trump, is what they need.
Yeah, well, yeah.
And there are not many of them out there. There are not many people like that.
I wish our audience could see me now. I'm keeping my mouth shut.
I'm much happier
here.
with Trump too than you are.
Yeah, I know. I mean, look, I'm happy with certain things.
Oh, you're very happy with certain things.
I am happy with certain things.
Have you taken your morning look at the Fodro nuclear site, Danny?
Yeah. Well.
Yeah.
Fordow. Yeah.
Fordow.
Yeah.
Take a look at that. Anytime
too.
you're having doubts, just take a look at the picture of that satellite image and just smile and go on with your day.
Yes, close your eyes and think of Fordow. Okie dokie. It's great to be back. We've missed everybody. We hope you missed us. Hope you enjoyed the August book series, and lots more politics coming soon. Take care,
See you
everyone.
next week. Let us know what topics you'd like us to cover. You can get in touch with the show by emailing us at whatthehell@aei.org.
Or you can reach us on Twitter. I'm at @dpletka.
And I'm at Mark Thiessen. That's Mark with a C.
Please rate and review the podcast. If you like the show, please subscribe, share it, comment on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening to this.
Thanks for listening.